Hey, Detoxers. Welcome to Disinfo Detox, the show that cuts through the lies and scrubs propaganda from public discourse. As always, this podcast is all about breaking down the big stories in the news and giving you the context you won't get from the corporate media. Today, we're digging into the legal battles, threats, and hush money payments surrounding President Donald Trump and the press. And to help us unpack it all, we've got a great guest, the Distinguished Director of the Parks Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College, Director of Project Censored, and President of the Media Freedom Foundation, my friend, co-author, and accomplice, Mickey Huff. Welcome to Disinfo Detox.
Nolan, it is wonderful to be here on Disinfo Detox with you. Congratulations on the launching of yet another new project. It's great to be here. We've been stirring the pot around media for quite some time, so I'm looking forward to doing it here.
Absolutely. So it's good to be together and chat again, as always. So, Mickey, let's get right into it. Obviously, during the first Trump term, there was a lot of discussion about Trump's war on the press, or depending on where you stand ideologically, some people saw it as the press's war on Trump. But regardless, there were these entanglements, right? And it seems different to me, at least this time. I'm interested to hear what you say. Trump seems to be leveraging the courts in a way that he simply didn't during his first term. So what say you about some of these lawsuits? We can talk about some of the specifics, but first, what do you think about some of these lawsuits that Trump has out against these different news networks?
Well, Nolan, I'm already in agreement with the shift in tactics here that you're alluding to. You and I wrote a book in towards the mid end of the first Trump administration when he was electored in against Hillary Clinton. Again, he didn't win the popular vote. But a big part of that campaign, Trump not only manipulated the media, but attacked the media and tried to lure the media in, to this, wrestling ring kind of thing, to tussle with them, which really, and the press kind of took the bait, which really debased, I think, their reputation as a fourth estate. And that's part of Trump's tactic, of course, is to make the media part of the narrative that he then rails against. And you and I wrote this book, The United States of Distraction, on media manipulation in post-truth America and what we can do about it. And we highlighted this, the approach that Trump had in attacking the media. And a lot of the attacks at the time were rhetorical. He weaponized the phrase fake news after the Democrats tried to use that against him with the Russians, saying that the Russians helped him with fake news, and that's partly how they helped him win the election. And then Trump quickly weaponized that term, as you know. You're the author of The Anatomy of Fake News, basically the book on the topic. In that process, Trump then would refer to them as fake news, starting with James Acosta at CNN, and then he would run down the line, basically of the litany of the establishment press, the ones that Rush Limbaugh had basically primed the conservatives to say are the liberal media, the lying media, right? And at the time, Trump even went so far as to call them the enemy of the people and the lying press, riffing back to the Germans in World War I with the Lügenpresse. And of course, we know Adolf Hitler and the Nazis used that tactic of the Lügenpresse and the lying media, right, to debase the trust in the fourth estate. Trump's attacks against the press, beyond rhetorical, he would try to often sue for defamation, right? And it's difficult to do that because it's difficult to prove those cases in court. Fortunately, in the United States, despite our many flaws, the First Amendment and the press protections have historic precedent for being safeguarded by the courts in many cases. I mean, look, we go back to the Nixon years, notoriously, when Richard Nixon, I would argue historically foolishly, decided he wanted to try to take on the New York Times. He had a vendetta against Daniel Ellsberg from the Rand Corporation, who had leaked what are historically known as the Pentagon Papers, right? Interestingly, the Pentagon Papers said a lot more about Johnson and the Democrats than Nixon, and maybe if Nixon just kept quiet, who knows what would have happened. But nevertheless, Nixon couldn't.
Isn't that the story of Nixon's career? If he had just kept quiet, who knows what would have happened?
Would have just kept quiet, maybe we wouldn't have had in Vietnam and wouldn't have helped kill another 3 million Vietnamese. Though let's remember that the Democrats and Republicans both had hands in that one. But back then in 71, the Supreme Court sided with the New York Times and with Ellsberg that the public had a right to know. And that's a really serious precedent, a serious case. I'm sure Nixon now would blush with the kind of things that we've seen happen with the courts and the press. Although there are certainly the courts have still been upholding the press protections when it comes to defamation, but that's partly where we've seen a shift in tactic that you just alluded to moments ago. What we see now
Mickey, let me jump in, yeah, for 1 second on that, because I think you're bringing up a good point that I want to tie to the stories. Yeah, for audience members who don't know, to prove defamation in court, you have to prove that you knowingly lied and that there were damages. So it's a really high bar, especially for the press. If you go after someone who's famous, it's not just enough that it's inaccurate. You have to prove that it cost them something and that the press did it with some intent.
malice.
Yeah, right. And to your point about the Pentagon Papers, right? That was a prior restraint. So the court said the government cannot stop something because of what they predict will happen. There has to be damages to show to stop it. And I think what where you were getting, what I liked what you were doing there is you're talking about these more recent lawsuits, right? And for folks who don't know, ABC settled with the Trump administration just back in December for reportedly $15 million.
Yeah,
For falsely claiming he was found guilty of
rape
rape.
versus sexual assault, right? And that was George Stephanopoulos who misspoke on air. And I mean, I think that could have been argued that again, some of the criticism against places like ABC is that it's unwise that they're capitulating, but Trump is so wildly suing for such extraordinary sums. He's using the Center for American Rights, conservative legal group that's filing similar lawsuits against the Des Moines Register. They're filing suits. Of course, they filed the suit against ABC that paid $16 million. They're now suing Paramount, CBS, and they're trying to get them to settle. And it's looking like that CBS is going to settle. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about some of the specificity around those cases. But this is the new approach, right, Nolan? And ABC did resolve. They did settle to resolve quote defamation, which is kind of absurd if you really look at what happened with Trump. I mean, it's really splitting hairs in a lot of ways. But now they're going after these news outlets for consumer protection, right? So it's not a defamation, it's not prior restraint, it's consumer protection because the public are subscribers to these kinds of outlets, and if these news outlets then are telling them false information, they're abusing consumer rights. Only in a capitalist, utopia like the United States would we be fixated so wildly on things like consumer protection versus First Amendment rights. I'm not making light of consumer protection. I mean, you and I, Ralph Nader wrote the foreword to our book, United States: A Distraction. One of the foremost consumer rights, lawyers in U.S. history, right? So I'm not making light of that, but I think this is a really coy and duplicitous way, a disingenuous way, really, of just trying to send a chilling effect across news organizations. And ABC and CBS are well-heeled organizations. These are companies that actually have money. Reuters ran down a list of these. So did Al Jazeera. The Des Moines Register was being sued over a polling lawsuit where Trump claims that in the waning days of the 2024 election, they ran a poll that put him 13 points up, and the next day he won. And he claims that this was all on purpose to skew the consumer perception of the Des Moines Register, even though there's no evidence that there were deceptive poll tactics. There's no evidence that anything was done to manipulate the data. Greg Palast would suggest that maybe we should be looking at somewhere else to see manipulation, like among votes, but we won't get into that. But this is the tactic now, is to go after these kind of news outlets. You mentioned ABC, George Stephanopoulos. Well, CBS, now they're going after 60 Minutes for the Kamala Harris interview. And Trump filed a $10 billion lawsuit against CBS in October, saying that the network deceptively edited interviews that tipped the scales in favor of the Democratic Party. Well, I'm still waiting to see how those scales were tipped, Nolan, given that that didn't actually happen. But there's no evidence that this happened. There's no evidence that CBS deceptively edited, in this case, anything with Harris. Yet they seem to be on the verge of coming to some kind of settlement, which is the wrong message to send in this time when we see a blitzkrieg shock and awe attack against the press, against civil society, against public institutions with Doge and everything else that's going on. We need to stand firm behind the First Amendment. We need to stand firm to protect not only press freedoms, but we need to protect the public's right to know. So to see these kinds of major news outlets capitulating to this is terribly unfortunate. CNN, in fact, was being sued for defamation under the big lie in 2023 when Trump was suing them for $475 million because they called the big lie that he kept saying over and over that he won the 2020 election. Well, there's no evidence that he won the 2020 election. There's, in fact, evidence that he didn't win the 2020 election. Yet, he, Giuliani, and a number of his other minions continued to double down, triple down over and over and over and over again. So, fortunately, that suit was dismissed, right? Because it's defamation. But now, now that they're going around and they're suing over consumer protection, that's opening up an entirely new can of legal worms that is having a chilling effect across the board, which is why I think CBS is coming to the bargaining table.
It's also hilarious. This is all occurring at a time when they're talking about getting rid of the Consumer Protection Bureau, but they're worried about consumers in the courts. But I want to, so I want to play the clip of CBS. And for folks who don't know, so again, Trump said that they aired an edited clip in an effort to aid Harris, which he's indicating was their way of trying to help her campaign beat him. So
the work that we have done has resulted in a number of movements in that region by Israel that were very much prompted by or a result of many things, including our advocacy for what needs to happen in the region. And we're not going to stop doing that. We're not going to stop pursuing what is necessary for the United States to be clear about where we stand on the need for this war to end. We're not going to stop pursuing what is necessary for the United States to be clear about where we stand on the need for this war to end.
Okay, what I find fascinating about these, Mickey, and I want to get your take on them, is this to me, tell me what you think of this. This is so Trump, right? He can find kind of one of these gray areas and then he can like amplify it into being some sensationalistic news story. So there is editing clearly there. Yes, Harris does have like a history of word salads. So the edit could be, I think, like, at least two things. One is, yeah, I guess they could be trying to make her look better. Or this is an age-old practice in television. Audiences tend to like people who have coherent sentences. And so you can edit out things where maybe people are thinking out loud or misspeak. That seems more likely. And to your larger point earlier, there's no evidence that this shifted the election. So I think this is just Trump kind of brilliantly taking this gray area of like, we don't know what their motive was for an edit, but we know there was an edit. And then he tries to sell in his ancient wisdom as a grifter here, tries to sell the public on the idea that, yeah, this is a manipulation by the Democrats. Another example of the fake news. What do you think, Mickey?
I mean, look, we all know that news media organizations edit. And, the founder of founder of Project Censored, Carl Jensen, was actually criticized because what he was talking about censorship in the news media, and this was in the 70s and 80s, so a different era. They claimed, well, that's not fair. We have to make decisions about what gets on air, what gets in the precious column inches, et cetera, et cetera. And they called it news judgment or editing, right? And in this case, we clearly see that there's editing. Look, anybody that has been in media 15 minutes knows that they get edited. How many times have you and I been interviewed, Nolan, from outlets or from newspapers or wherever, where we'll talk to people for 15 minutes, half hour, sometimes an hour. We'll talk to people only to get something distilled down to two quotes.
Mm-hmm.
Or two, if it's a 30-minute interview and we get a few minutes that gets spliced together somewhere. Now, look, I understand that does allow for potential deception, but look, in this case particularly, when you have people, Harris in this case, kind of mumbling or, kind of sort of choking on her words or stumbling on her words or repeating things or false starting sentences. It's almost as if maybe she's the one that's dissembling. Maybe she's the one that's trying to not come out and say something. I don't know. But to suggest that CBS somehow, craftily sat there and spliced things together with a scalpel to make her say certain things in certain ways to defame Trump or to somehow delude the public into voting for her, even if they did, it didn't work, as we just suggested. It's a disingenuous legal tactic. And the idea that Trump cares one bit about consumer rights is probably the biggest joke that you and I will crack this program today. As you said, they're trying to dismantle, consumer protection as you and I speak. It's ludicrous. But I wanted to go back just for a second too. When CBS had to hand over transcripts of that interview, right? And the FCC is involved, etc. Seth Stern from the Freedom of the Press Foundation had this to say. He said, "This is a head scratcher for me for CBS to claim that it is legally compelled to turn over documents if it has no choice. Of course, it has a choice. There's a legal system where you can resist unconstitutional demands from the government. And they're free to assert their right, as plenty of news outlets do." In other words, Stern is saying, who cares what Trump is going to ask for the moon? In fact, no, he's not going to ask for it. He's going to take it or buy it. Just like he's talking about in Gaza, right? We're just going to take it over. He's doing the same thing in the media space. We want this information. We're going to shut you down. This is all part of the enemy of the press narrative that you and I wrote about in the United States of Distraction. He wasted no time. On day one, he had an executive order about protecting free speech, and these kinds of things. It's just laughable that he and Musk are somehow champions of free speech as they willy-nilly censor, shut down, and just wildly attack anybody with a temerity, not to just criticize them, but to say anything that they remotely disagree with. It's a tactic to shut down any kind of criticism, any kind of discourse or debate. And if the news media organizations that are the most well-heeled and well-funded don't use recourse through the courts to push back, smaller outlets will likely fall prey to the same tactics. Because the Trump administration will be emboldened by ABC. If CBS comes and settles, they'll be emboldened by that kind of a settlement. And then smaller outlets like the Des Moines Register or others they'll roll over. I mean, in some cases, these outlets are small enough, they might just shut down. We already have a news desert crisis in this country with 20% of the country not having any kind of local media. The Trump administration would love that. Then they could just beam in more Truth Social, more OAN. By the way, the Trump administration just did this at the Pentagon with Secretary Hegseth, where they're getting rid of the offices of the New York Times and Politico and NPR. So OAN and other far right-wing outlets actually get a seat. I'm not saying that news organizations shouldn't have a seat at press conferences, but it's New York Times and Politico and others, and you and I have criticized these outlets to the nth degree for rightfully so. But the idea that they're getting kicked out of the building, just shows you everything you need to know about what kind of a culture Trump is trying to create in the press room. He's trying to create an obedient lapdog press pool, and he's using this kind of litigation to cow anybody into conformity, to kind of bow and kiss the ring.
Yeah, and talk to me a little bit about this too. So I think most of our audience will know that there was very low approval for the press prior to Trump's first term. And, Trump clearly recognized that and fed into it, as you said at the beginning of the program, about going after Jim Acosta's of the world and other folks, calling them fake news. And so I think it's, Trump's playbook in discrediting the press is very clear, as you've laid out here. But what about the opposite side of that coin? I mean, the press's reaction to Trump, at least rhetorically, seemed to be the resistance, right? That's what they called themselves, and they were going to hold Trump accountable. But in practice, as you and I have written, they followed some stories down rabbit holes and ignored, legitimate critiques of the Trump administration. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe what effect it had on why today the press seems so unwilling to really fight Trump in a serious way in his second term as opposed to the first.
Well, Nolan, we know right from the beginning, as you and I wrote at the outset of United States of Distraction, when Les Moonves was at the tech convention in San Francisco before the 2016 election, and he said, bring it on, Donald. It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS, right? Right there, we see the Fourth Estate lining up, basically playing games, right? That they're going to cover him, but they're getting boosted ratings. They $6 billion of free coverage, double that Hillary Clinton got in the 2016 election, double that of Bernie Sanders. And then when after the 2016 election came, they had a whole mea culpa. The Washington Post said that democracy dies in darkness. They were doubling down. They were going to be the resistance media, as you just suggested. And then what did they do? They got right back into the wrestling ring and started playing the game where they became a figure with Trump and wrestling around. And then they proceeded to follow some of the dumbest, most groundless stories that went nowhere for years. Russiagate being chief among them. MSNBC made a cottage industry out of it. And somehow that's been at the center of the neoliberal campaign against disinformation. Never mind the 100 other examples you and I have cited and that Project Censored has cited where there are real tangible examples of corporate media reporting false information, where they do have an integrity problem that debases their trust in the public eye. But they tend to choose these sensational, idiotic things to follow for sometimes a year, like the impeachment proceeding, which went nowhere. It went absolutely nowhere, right? And that's the tactic. These organizations and institutions should be smarter than this. They should be more media literate than this to know that they're getting sucked into a non-story that has a political outcome that's not going to lead to anything that they think they want. They should stick to the hard facts. They should stick to the hard stories. They should investigate what's happening. Right now, instead of doing what Steve Bannon wants to flood the zone with so much bullshit, with so much nonsense. Boom, boom, boom. One day, 3 crazy stories. Chase them tomorrow. Boom, boom, boom. More crazy stories. He's shutting down education with the McMahon, who, by the way, is from the WWE. Let's just put the World Wide Wrestling people in charge of the education department that we're shutting down, right? I mean, it's just shock and awe. It's what crazy things will happen today that the press will never keep up with while they're simultaneously orchestrating the dismantling of the administrative state. They are going after Social Security and Medicare. They are going to try to go after these things. But meanwhile, the Democrats and the neoliberal press, right, the corporate media, they're all still stupefied, about whatever something that he did was on day 1 or 2, or they're still stupefied about the Gulf of America, or they're still stupefied about him at the Super Bowl, or the Stupor Bowl, as we should call it. This is why that the news media need to keep their eyes on the prize. And the prize isn't Trump and his distraction machine. It's what's Steve Miller doing? What are members of his cabinet trying to dismantle in government? What are these court cases that he's bringing against media? How spurious are they? They're very spurious. In fact, like I said, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, staunch supporter of free press, free expression, free speech, etc., educate academic freedom. They're like, look, this has a very, very damaging effect on society because they just keep repeating the message and repeating the tactics. They don't care necessarily if they win. They win when the media keep covering and repeating the tactics, even if they don't go anywhere. Right. And that's part of the strategy that I think that we also need to point out here. The latest is, of course, the attack on public broadcasting, that it is somehow a propaganda organ of the state. Well, I mean, I certainly welcome that possibility, given that you and I have written about the national propaganda radio campaigns over the years and how much propaganda does come through some of these kinds of outlets. But we mean very different kind of things. Not all media criticism is equal, right? And also when we see people painting with broad brushes that it's like, it's all corporate propaganda, it's all state propaganda. Look, that's very sloppy and anti-intellectual, and that's not the kind of media criticism that you do. It's not the kind that I do. It's not the kind that Project Censored does. It's not Andy Lee Roth and I don't do this kind of thing. The Park Center for Independent Media doesn't engage in this kind of stuff. You got to be very specific. You've got to go and say, you've got to have arguments. You've got to really deconstruct what's happening. In this case, they're just saying, well, NPR gets its money from the federal government. It's all propaganda. Shut it down. Do you know how much money do you know what percentage of the budget comes from the federal government for NPR? 1%. I mean, look, but this is why this works, Nolan. The public is largely media illiterate. They're civically illiterate. We read at a 6th grade level at best. And people don't understand how things work. They don't understand that there's all kind of underwriting and subsidizing and other ways, from viewers like you. But look, PBS, NPR, that's also underwritten by Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and Monsanto. It's the same kind of practice we see in corporate media, but they call it commercials, right? We do have a corporate money infestation problem in media that debases content that's not in the public interest. But it's very disingenuous to go after these outlets as the way in which the Trump administration is pursuing it. And I think that if the smart people at the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or CNN or MSNBC or Fox, there are smart people at all of them. I know people don't like to admit that. If they would just stand together for a moment and put away the team red, team blue jerseys and focus on the First Amendment and the free press and realize how they're all under assault. The Biden administration had a campaign against the press. They had a campaign against social media. They got caught doing it, further debasing public trust, which is now at historic lows for the media, but like down where Congress is. But that's earned. If the press would reverse the behavior, if they would stop playing the petty games that they play, and they would stand in unison, like when Anthony Blinken did his final press conference, which was just a self-hagiographic, congratulatory, propagandizing about how great he was and how great everything was going around the world because of Biden and Blinken. Max Blumenthal and Sam Husseini were yanked out of that press conference for interrupting and asking questions that Blinken would never ask about Israel or Gaza.
They were mocked on CNN too, for asking questions.
And then CNN mocked them for not being journalists and being activists.
For 3 people. You pontificate about a free press. You pontificate about a free press. You are hurting me. You are hurting me. You are hurting me. I am asking questions after being told by Matt Miller that he will not answer my questions until I'm asking questions. Wasn't the point of the May 31st statement to block the ICJ order?
As you heard, he was repeatedly interrupted by some cringeworthy heckling.
And watched as the Gestapo pulled them physically out. Sam pulled him physically out of his chair as he said, "You're hurting me. You're hurting me." And I would like to take Sam Husseini's statement and push it to the American public. The American public is saying, "You're hurting us. You're hurting us by not answering these questions, by not doing your due diligence in supporting press freedoms." Trump is cynically, just like Biden and Blinken were, they're cynically damaging the press, and they are cynically damaging the American public.
Thank you very much, Mickey. And I absolutely agree. As we wrap up here, that was one of the big frustrations, right? Is when you would talk about fake news, the press acted like it was Trump who was this magician who had killed their approval in the public. And it's like, you have these big WMD failure type stories that really inspired a generation to get into media like myself. But more to the point, as you point out, when there are legitimate critics who are pointing out errors like Project Censored and the work you and Andy and Shaylee and those folks do over there and myself, they hide it. They pretend like it doesn't exist. That's what contributes to the lack of faith in them. If they had just, fired Maddow after the Russiagate disaster, fired everybody after they at Fox for saying the election was stolen, then you'd have faith in them. They would take action. But instead, they defend, they dilute, they lie, they deflect, and you just lose.
the cycle of cynicism continues. And, I was interviewed by the New York Times last year in the fall about why the public has waning trust in the establishment press. And it was almost like a Monty Python skit. I was just like, have you read your paper? Have you looked in the mirror? And this reporter, to their credit, for reaching out to interview me and other media scholars like Victor Picard at UPenn, Annenberg, and Unit for Democratic Communications. In that interview, also were people like Marty Barron, the former editor of the Washington Post, who's the guy that embraced Propernaut and launched Russiagate. Basically at the Washington Post. Somehow, and he's like, well, we would have done things differently, and da-da-da. Somehow our criticism was put on equal footing in the New York Times interview, and it's just complete balderdash. But there's no space in the New York Times for the criticism that we had to offer. And I was specifically told by the reporter that they couldn't use my quotes in the paper because I used the New York Times as an example. And I said, that's why the public doesn't trust you.
Well, let's leave it there, Mickey. I'm sure I'll have you back again. Always welcome on the show. Why don't you remind people, where can they follow your work? Where can they hear more of Mickey Huff or read more of Mickey Huff?
Thanks so much, Nolan. I'm around on social media. I have a personal account on Facebook from forever ago, but you can go to projectcensored.org. You can follow Project Censored on Instagram and TikTok, where we're trying to reach people where they are about these specific issues. So projectcensored.org is the way to go. Project Censored shows on every week. We've been on 15 years, Pacifica Radio, also in the podcast universe. Nolan, you're a regular guest, have been for years, giving your erudite criticism of the media and talking about free press, First Amendment issues. Also, parkindymedia.org for the Park Center, where I'm professor of journalism at Ithaca College. And soon this spring, we're going to be having the 17th Izzy Awards honoring the best and brightest of the independent press. So, Nolan, it's just a delight to be here with you. And go Disinfo Detox. We need more of this kind of important discourse. And thanks so much for the opportunity. And thanks for all you're doing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mickey. And I'll also plug The Edge for him. Mickey runs the Park Center over there at Ithaca. So check out The Edge, a bunch of great writers. I've been able to write there, and they're doing some great work on media. So check out what Mickey has going on. Mickey Huff, thank you very much. And thank you all very much for tuning into the Disinfo Detox.
Hey, Detoxers. Thanks again for tuning in. Make sure to like, subscribe, and follow Disinfo Detox wherever you get your podcasts. Detox complete.